January of 1977 was supposed to be just another summer evening in Collingwood, Melbourne. The area was a mix of working-class charm and the quiet camaraderie of neighbors who knew each other well. But on Easey Street, the air turned heavy with unease. Inside a modest Victorian terrace house, an unspeakable horror lay hidden behind closed doors. Suzanne Armstrong, 30, and Susan Bartlett, 28, were vibrant young women who shared a home together. Suzanne, a single mother, had a 16-month-old son, Gregory. The two women were known for their kindness and close friendship, and their house often echoed with laughter. But that week, something felt different. Neighbors began to notice the absence of activity in the house. The usual sounds of conversation and Gregory's cries or giggles had faded into silence. Concerned, one neighbor decided to check in, only to hear a faint, heart-wrenching sound: Gregory crying. The cries had been going on for days. Alarmed, the neighbor called the authorities. When police arrived and stepped inside the house, they were met with a scene that would haunt them for decades. Suzanne and Susan had been brutally murdered. Suzanne's body was discovered in her bedroom, stabbed multiple times. Susan's body was found in a similar state in her own room. The sheer violence of the attack left officers speechless, but what made it even more chilling was the sight of baby Gregory, alive but severely dehydrated, lying in his crib amidst the carnage. The home, once a sanctuary, had become the setting of a nightmare. How could such a heinous crime occur in a neighborhood where everyone knew each other? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the investigation began. It wasn't just the deaths of Suzanne and Susan that horrified the public. It was the fact that the killer had left an innocent child to fend for himself in the aftermath of their savagery. This brutal crime marked the beginning of a mystery that would haunt Collingwood and the nation for nearly 50 years. As the police crossed the threshold of the modest terrace home on Easey Street, they were immediately struck by an unsettling silence, broken only by the faint cries of Suzanne's infant son. What lay beyond the hallway, however, would etch itself into their memories forever. The house was eerily still, with no sign of a forced entry. In Suzanne Armstrong's bedroom, the first horrifying discovery was made. Suzanne had been stabbed repeatedly, her lifeless body left in a pool of blood. The sheer number of wounds spoke of a frenzied, merciless attack, suggesting deep rage or desperation. In the adjacent bedroom, Susan Bartlett's fate mirrored Suzanne's. She too had been stabbed multiple times, her body positioned in a way that suggested she had tried to defend herself against the onslaught. The violence inflicted on both women was shockingly disproportionate, leaving investigators grappling with the question: who could harbor such animosity toward two women who were universally described as kind and gentle? Yet, as brutal as the scene was, it was also baffling. No valuables appeared to be missing, ruling out robbery as a motive. The doors and windows were intact, indicating that the killer may have been let in or had entered quietly. There were no clear signs of a struggle in the common areas of the house, leaving the murders shrouded in eerie precision. One haunting detail stood out: the killer had left Gregory unharmed. The child's survival amidst the carnage raised chilling questions. Was it a deliberate act of mercy? Or had the killer's focus been so consumed by their heinous intentions toward Suzanne and Susan that they simply overlooked the baby? The crime scene offered few answers and even fewer leads. There was no immediate evidence to suggest who might have committed such an atrocity or why. What was clear was that this wasn't a random act of violence. This was calculated, personal, and terrifyingly deliberate. As officers began their meticulous examination of the scene, they knew they were at the start of a case that would challenge every investigative technique of the time and leave the community gripped by fear and suspicion for years to come. In the immediate aftermath of the horrific discovery, investigators combed through the house on Easey Street, determined to unearth anything that could identify the killer. The crime scene was meticulously documented, and the smallest details were scrutinized. For a brief moment, hope flickered. Blood evidence was found near the bodies, and it was clear that some of it didn't belong to Suzanne or Susan. Could the killer have injured themselves during the frenzied attack? Potential fingerprints were also lifted from surfaces around the house, and neighbors reported seeing an unfamiliar man lingering near the property in the days leading up to the murders. Yet, for every promising lead, a dead end seemed to follow. The blood evidence, while significant, could not be matched to anyone in the limited databases of the time. Fingerprints, which today would have been cross-referenced in seconds, required a slow and labor-intensive manual process, yielding no matches. The witness accounts, though vital, were vague and inconsistent, describing a figure that could have been almost anyone. The painstaking efforts of investigators soon turned to frustration. Without surveillance cameras, digital records, or DNA profiling tools that are now cornerstones of modern policing, they were left with pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit together. The lack of forced entry suggested the killer might have been someone the victims knew, yet no one in their social circles raised any suspicion. Friends and family were interviewed extensively, but no motive emerged. Suzanne and Susan lived quiet, unassuming lives, and there was no indication they had any enemies. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation began to lose momentum. The media seized on the story, amplifying the public's fears. Headlines speculated wildly about a mysterious predator lurking in Collingwood. With no solid leads, theories ranged from an unhinged stranger to a calculated personal vendetta. Despite the diligent work of the detectives, the case began to stall. Forensics in the 70s, though cutting edge for its time, lacked the precision needed to solve such a complex crime. The killer had seemingly vanished into thin air, leaving investigators to grapple with an unsettling reality. The person who committed this brutal double murder might never be found. And so, the case began its descent into the cold, shadowed corridors of unresolved mysteries, where it would linger for decades until modern science and dogged persistence finally unearthed new possibilities. Time has a way of softening the edges of even the most harrowing memories, but for the residents of Collingwood, the events of January 1977 cast a long and unshakable shadow. Easey Street, once an ordinary road in a working-class neighborhood, became a name whispered with unease, synonymous with a crime so brutal it defied comprehension. The house where Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett lived, once filled with laughter and warmth, stood empty for months. Even after it was eventually reoccupied, its dark history lingered, a chilling reminder of the unsolved tragedy. Neighbors avoided looking at it for too long, their minds haunted by what had taken place within its walls. For Suzanne and Susan's families, moving on was a luxury they couldn't afford. The silence that followed the murders was unbearable. Every day without answers was another day spent wondering who could have committed such a horrific act and how they had managed to escape unnoticed. Suzanne's mother, in particular, was tormented by the thought of her daughter's killer still walking free, perhaps even living a normal life, untouched by the weight of their crimes. The community's initial fear eventually gave way to resignation. Conversations about the murders became less frequent, replaced by a quiet acceptance that the case might never be solved. But the unease never fully disappeared. People locked their doors earlier, cast wary glances at strangers, and held their loved ones a little closer. For the investigators, the case was a constant burden. It became a ghost haunting their careers, a reminder of the limits of their tools and the cruel reality of unsolved mysteries. Some detectives retired with the knowledge that they had done everything they could, yet it hadn't been enough. Others remained quietly hopeful that one day advancements in technology or a stroke of luck might bring the killer to justice. Easey Street remained a stain on the city of Melbourne, a place where unspeakable violence had shattered the illusion of safety. For decades, the families and the community carried the weight of silence, knowing that the person who had so violently taken Suzanne and Susan's lives had walked away unseen and unheard. But even as the years stretched into decades, the story of the Easey Street murders refused to fade completely. There were those who never stopped searching, never stopped hoping, and never stopped believing that justice, though long delayed, could still be served. As the calendar turned to the 80s, the Easey Street murders settled uneasily into the category of unsolved mysteries, now officially labeled a cold case. The initial surge of tips, theories, and potential leads had slowed to a trickle, leaving investigators with little to act on. Suspects who had once seemed promising were ruled out, their alibis holding up under scrutiny or evidence failing to link them to the crime. The neighborhood, once gripped by fear and speculation, began to move forward, though the scars of that January night lingered. The sense of collective unease faded into the background, replaced by resignation, a quiet acceptance that the killer might never be found. For law enforcement, however, the case remained a weight they couldn't shrug off. Despite the lack of fresh leads, it was revisited periodically, often by detectives who couldn't let it go. Each new team brought fresh eyes and renewed determination, combing through old evidence, re-interviewing witnesses, and re-examining every detail of the crime scene. But the killer remained elusive, a ghost haunting the corridors of Melbourne's history. The families of Suzanne and Susan were left with nothing but memories and questions that would not go away. The silence surrounding the case felt like a cruel punishment, as if time itself had conspired to bury the truth. And yet, the hope for justice persisted. Detectives, families, and true crime enthusiasts alike held onto the belief that one day anything might crack the case open. As the world stepped into the 21st century, advancements in technology began to rewrite the rules of criminal investigations. DNA analysis, once a distant dream, became a powerful tool for solving even the coldest of cases. For detectives still haunted by the unsolved Easey Street murders, these advancements offered a glimmer of hope. The blood samples and other physical evidence from the crime scene, carefully preserved for decades, were revisited with renewed urgency. What had once been beyond the reach of science could now hold the key to unlocking the mystery. In the early 2000s, investigators began retesting the evidence using modern forensic techniques. The DNA extracted from the crime scene was run through growing databases, hoping for a match that would finally identify the killer. Familial DNA testing, which could point to relatives of the perpetrator, added another layer of possibility. With every new round of testing, anticipation grew. Could this breakthrough technology finally succeed where traditional methods had failed? The potential for answers loomed large, but with it came the weight of years of uncertainty. Though the early efforts yielded no immediate match, they reignited the case. The idea that the killer's identity might be encoded in the samples left behind a silent witness, waiting to speak, gave investigators a renewed sense of purpose. The families of Suzanne and Susan too found themselves cautiously hopeful. After decades of silence, there was a chance that science could succeed where human intuition and effort had fallen short. As the case moved into this new era, the question remained: would DNA be the key to uncovering the truth, or would the killer continue to evade justice? The answer, as it turned out, would take even more time to unfold, but the tools of forensic science had set the stage for what would eventually become a seismic breakthrough in one of Australia's most haunting cold cases. For all the promise that DNA technology held, the Easey Street murders proved maddeningly resistant to resolution. By the mid-2000s, investigators had exhausted the available tools of the time. DNA evidence, while tested and retested, failed to yield a direct match in any criminal database. Each negative result felt like a blow to both the detectives and the victims' families, who had dared to hope that modern science would finally deliver justice. Public appeals were renewed, with law enforcement releasing details of the case to stir up potential leads. Documentaries and podcasts began revisiting the murders, casting fresh light on the brutal killings and the years of investigative dead ends. Media attention reignited public interest, but the tips that poured in were either redundant or unhelpful. Still, behind the scenes, law enforcement was far from giving up. Advances in DNA science, particularly familial DNA testing, offered a potential path forward. Investigators began exploring this avenue, painstakingly combing through samples for indirect matches DNA that might not belong to the killer but could lead to their relatives. It was an agonizingly slow process, requiring patience, precision, and determination. The frustration of chasing a phantom continued to loom large, but law enforcement quietly pressed on. Each breakthrough in technology or forensics carried the possibility of a resolution just out of reach. Suzanne and Susan's families waited, their hope flickering but never fully extinguished. Unbeknownst to the public, the breakthrough they had long awaited was closer than anyone realized. In 2023, the decades-long silence surrounding the Easey Street murders was broken. Whispers of progress began to emerge, stirring cautious optimism among those who had followed the case for years. A familial DNA hit, an indirect match found through advanced testing, provided investigators with a critical clue. The match didn't point directly to the killer, but to a relative, opening a new investigative pathway. Forensic genealogists, specialists in tracing familial connections through DNA, joined the effort. Through meticulous research, they began piecing together a web of relationships, zeroing in on a man whose past was shrouded in suspicion. As the pieces came together, a name emerged. This individual, now in his 60s, held dual Greek and Australian citizenship and had spent much of his life outside of Australia. His history was checkered, marked by troubling allegations and a pattern of evasion. The discovery was electrifying but also sobering. The suspect had lived freely for decades, building a life in Greece, while the families of Suzanne and Susan were left to grapple with grief and uncertainty. For law enforcement, the challenge was no longer identifying the suspect, it was bringing him to justice. Investigators worked tirelessly to build their case, compiling decades of evidence and coordinating with international authorities. It was a race against time with one goal in mind: to ensure that the man linked to this heinous crime would finally face the consequences of his actions. This breakthrough marked the beginning of the end for one of Australia's most notorious cold cases. After nearly 50 years, the walls were closing in on the suspect, and the long-awaited pursuit of justice was finally within reach. The man now linked to the Easey Street murders had, for decades, managed to evade justice. By the time investigators connected the dots, he was in his 60s and had built a new life far from the streets of Collingwood. Reports suggested he had left Australia not long after the murders, slipping quietly out of the country before the net could close around him. For years, he had resided in Greece, a country where he could live with relative ease, shielded by a legal system that offered him protection. Greece's statute of limitations for certain crimes had effectively made it impossible for Australian authorities to arrest him, even if they had the evidence to do so. This legal loophole became his sanctuary, allowing him to avoid scrutiny while the families of Suzanne and Susan waited in anguish for answers. How he managed to stay hidden for so long was a question that baffled even seasoned investigators. He had no criminal record that would raise red flags and had seemingly blended into his surroundings. Friends, acquaintances, and neighbors in Greece described him as an unassuming figure, a man who gave no outward sign of his dark past. But even as the years passed, the weight of his alleged crimes never disappeared entirely. The advances in forensic science and the relentless determination of investigators had finally caught up with him. The suspect had evaded capture for decades, but the walls around his carefully constructed life were starting to crumble. September 2024 marked a turning point in the decades-long pursuit of justice. After years of painstaking investigation and international coordination, the suspect's freedom came to an abrupt end at Rome's Fiumicino airport. The man, now a dual citizen of Greece and Australia, had left his sanctuary in Greece and was traveling to Italy. Unbeknownst to him, an international arrest warrant had been issued in connection with the Easey Street murders. Italian authorities, acting on information from their Australian counterparts, were waiting for him. As the suspect stepped off the plane, he was immediately apprehended. It was a moment of triumph for law enforcement and a long-awaited step toward justice for the families of Suzanne and Susan. The arrest was a testament to the power of persistence, collaboration, and the advancements in forensic science that had made such a development possible. The arrest sent shockwaves across the globe, reigniting media coverage of the Easey Street murders. For nearly 50 years, the case had remained one of Australia's most notorious unsolved mysteries. Now, with the suspect in custody, the prospect of answers and accountability seemed closer than ever. But the battle was far from over. As the suspect sat in an Italian holding cell, the next chapter of this case was just beginning. Australian authorities were preparing to launch the complex legal process of extradition, determined to bring him home to face charges for the brutal crimes that had haunted Melbourne for decades. The chase across borders had ended, but the fight for justice was just getting started. The man now accused of one of Australia's most notorious cold case murders remains shrouded in legal anonymity, his name withheld due to ongoing proceedings. However, fragments of his life are beginning to surface, offering a glimpse into the shadowy existence of someone who had evaded justice for nearly half a century. Born in Australia, the suspect spent much of his youth in Melbourne, a fact that places him in close proximity to the events of 1977. At some point, he left the country and established a life in Greece, where he lived for years under the radar. It's unclear how he supported himself during this time, but accounts from those who knew him suggest he maintained a low profile, avoiding anything that might draw attention to his past. He holds dual citizenship, a status that likely aided his ability to move freely between countries. This dual identity allowed him to create a new life, while the memory of the murders lingered like an open wound back in Melbourne. The more investigators dig, the clearer it becomes that this man carefully constructed a facade of normalcy, a life free from the shadows of his alleged crimes. For nearly 50 years, he lived as though the past couldn't touch him. But now, with his arrest, the carefully woven fabric of his life is beginning to unravel, exposing the secrets he thought he had left behind. The suspect's arrest in Rome was a monumental step, but it marked only the beginning of a new and complicated legal battle. Australian authorities are now working tirelessly to secure his extradition, a process that is proving as complex as it is critical. Legal experts anticipate a contentious fight. The suspect's long residence in Greece, a country with statutes that previously shielded him from prosecution, adds a layer of complication to the case. His dual citizenship and his recent arrest in Italy further entangle the proceedings, creating a web of international legalities that must be navigated with precision. Italy, Greece, and Australia must now cooperate to determine the suspect's fate. Australian authorities have made it clear that they are committed to bringing him back to Melbourne to face charges related to the brutal murders of Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett. For the families of the victims, the extradition represents a critical step in their decades-long fight for justice. The families of Suzanne and Susan are watching closely, their emotions swinging between hope and apprehension. Each delay, each procedural hurdle feels like another twist of the knife. The prospect of finally confronting the man accused of taking their loved ones is within reach, but the road ahead remains fraught with uncertainty. As the legal battle unfolds, the world watches. The extradition case has become a symbol of the lengths to which law enforcement will go to pursue justice even decades after the crime. For Suzanne and Susan's families, it is a long-awaited chance to find closure, but only if the process succeeds. The house on Easey Street, now unremarkable among the rows of similar Victorian terrace homes in Collingwood, holds an indelible place in Melbourne's dark history. Long since occupied by new tenants, its exterior shows no sign of the violence that occurred within its walls nearly 50 years ago. But for those who remember, the address remains a symbol of tragedy and unanswered questions. With the arrest of a suspect, the house has drawn renewed attention. Journalists and true crime enthusiasts have descended upon Easey Street, retracing the steps of investigators and speculating on the details of that fateful night. Documentaries and online forums have reignited debates, asking the same haunting question: how could such a brutal crime occur in such an ordinary home? For neighbors who lived in Collingwood at the time, the renewed focus is a painful reminder. Many had tried to put the murders behind them, but the house still stands as a silent witness to an atrocity that shook their community. To outsiders, it is a chilling landmark. To locals, it is a scar that never fully healed. As the investigation gained momentum following the arrest, new forensic revelations began to emerge. Advances in technology and the meticulous re-examination of old evidence revealed unsettling details that had been obscured for decades. It now appears that the murders of Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett may not have been as random as they initially seemed. For years, investigators had operated under the assumption that the killer might have been a stranger, but the new evidence hints at a different possibility. Detectives are exploring whether Suzanne and Susan might have known their killer. Was there a motive buried beneath layers of fear and silence? Personal connections, once dismissed as insignificant, are now being re-examined in light of this new perspective. The idea that the crime could have stemmed from a relationship or prior encounter adds a chilling layer of complexity to the case. This revelation has raised more questions than answers. If Suzanne and Susan knew their killer, what prompted such unimaginable violence? Was it premeditated, or did something trigger the attack that night? As investigators dig deeper, the possibility of uncovering these hidden truths feels tantalizingly close. For the residents of Collingwood, the arrest of a suspect in the Easey Street murders brings with it a mix of relief and unease. After nearly 50 years of living under the shadow of an unsolved double homicide, there is finally progress. But with that progress comes the reopening of wounds long thought to have healed. Those who lived in the neighborhood in 1977 still vividly remember the fear that gripped their community. The murders shattered the sense of safety they once took for granted, and overnight, Collingwood became a place where locking doors and checking windows became second nature. For the younger generation, many of whom grew up hearing whispers of the infamous case, the arrest is a reminder of the dark history their neighborhood carries. But it also brings hope, a sign that even the coldest of cases can be revived, and justice, though delayed, is still possible. As Collingwood comes to terms with this new chapter, the community is beginning to heal once more. The arrest offers closure for some, though others are haunted by the thought of what might have been prevented had the killer been caught earlier. The scars left by the murders remain, but with each step forward, the weight of the past begins to lift, allowing the neighborhood to reclaim its identity, one day at a time. With the arrest of a suspect in the Easey Street murders, the story has once again captured global attention. Media outlets across the world are revisiting the decades-old case, sparking renewed interest among true crime enthusiasts and casual observers alike. Documentaries, podcasts, and investigative series are diving deep into the timeline, piecing together the gruesome events of 1977 and the long road that led to the arrest. For those fascinated by true crime, this case is a chilling reminder of how justice can take decades to catch up with those who attempt to outrun it. Social media platforms are abuzz with speculation and debate as the public grapples with the unanswered questions and the implications of this monumental breakthrough. The attention is bittersweet for the victims' families who now see their loved ones' stories splashed across headlines once more. For the families of Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett, the arrest brings a wave of mixed emotions. In public statements, they have expressed relief and cautious optimism, acknowledging the hard work of law enforcement and the persistence that led to this moment. After decades of pain and unanswered questions, the possibility of closure feels almost surreal. But even as they look toward the future, the families are haunted by a lingering question. What could have driven someone to commit such unimaginable violence? Their grief, long buried beneath years of silence, has resurfaced, accompanied by hope that justice might finally be within reach. They remain steadfast in their determination to see this case through to its conclusion, no matter how long it takes. The arrest has set the stage for what promises to be a landmark trial. Legal teams on both sides are preparing to examine evidence spanning nearly 5 decades, drawing on international cooperation and advancements in forensic science. For prosecutors, the challenge will be to present a cohesive narrative that connects the suspect to the crime beyond a shadow of a doubt. For the defense, the goal will be to scrutinize every piece of evidence and question the reliability of memories and records that have endured the test of time. The trial is not just about the suspect, it is about the victims, the families, and the community that has waited almost 50 years for answers. As the legal proceedings unfold, the world will watch closely, eager to see how justice will be served. Even with the suspect in custody, the case remains shrouded in mystery. Investigators and the public alike are left grappling with a series of unresolved questions. Did the suspect act alone, or was there another party involved? Why were Suzanne and Susan targeted on that fateful night? And how did the suspect manage to evade detection for so long while living freely in another country? Perhaps most haunting is the question of motive. Was this a random act of violence, or was it rooted in something far more personal? The answers to these questions will shape not only the trial, but also how the victims and their families are remembered. The Easey Street murders have become a poignant reminder that justice, though delayed, is not beyond reach. This case underscores the tireless efforts of investigators who refuse to give up, the power of technological innovation, and the resilience of families who have fought for decades to see justice served. As the trial looms, the story of Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett continues to resonate, a symbol of how determination can illuminate even the darkest corners of unsolved mysteries. The lessons of this case will endure, serving as inspiration for future investigations and a reminder that justice, no matter how long it takes, is worth pursuing. The world will be watching as this chapter of the Easey Street murders comes to its long-awaited climax. What are your thoughts on this case? Could justice, even after nearly 50 years, truly bring closure? Share your insights in the comments and stay tuned as this gripping story unfolds. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories that uncover the mysteries of the past and celebrate the pursuit of justice.